Hello, I am Michael Brendan Dougherty. I'm the editor of the Slurve, which is a daily newsletter about baseball, and an occasional contributor to the American Conservative and ESPN Magazine and other places. And this is a return episode of The Score. We've lost an episode since the last time we checked in, and I'm here today with Travis Waldron. Travis, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Travis Waldron. I am the sports reporter at Think Progress, the news section that we have started to cover sports both from a business perspective and from sort of a progressive political perspective as well. So thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be here.
Cool. So, Travis, I definitely want to talk about covering sports from a progressive political perspective, and I don't want to subsume the whole show in this, but let's just talk a little bit about what happened this week with Major League Baseball suspending Ryan Braun for the rest of the season, or at least coming to an agreement that he'll be suspended for the rest of the season with Ryan Braun. He's not contesting it through the MLB Players Association, and I was just wondering what your take was on that, and maybe on the whole biogenesis investigation altogether.
Well, I think it's definitely interesting, given the past history with Ryan Braun. Of course, I wrote about it yesterday. I think I'm kind of skeptical of baseball fans, how much they really care about this. We always see outrage whenever this happens, but it seems to me that people say they care. And they want a really clean baseball game, but people haven't stopped watching baseball because of steroids. They haven't stopped because of the first steroid era. In fact, steroids played a big part in bringing baseball back from the 94 strike and everything. And so I think it's interesting. I think the biogenesis scandal now is kind of indicative of that fact that maybe we don't care as much as we say we do, and also that maybe we ought to rethink the way that we're really going after the steroid crisis. But I definitely don't think Ryan Braun is a defensible guy or anything. I think he sort of deserves this, and he actually might have gotten off a little easy considering that the big money in his contract doesn't come until later, and the Brewers aren't exactly in playoff contention right now.
Yeah, I mean he had. It's funny, columnists have been lining up that he had all of these material interests in ending this as soon as possible. And it looks like he's done that successfully. I agree with you that I think people will continue to watch baseball even if it becomes, if it reverts back to its kind of 1997-98 form of, huge sluggers, just doing whatever kind of cocktail of steroids and stimulants that they were on. But I find I do care about PED abuse in baseball, but for just a few limited reasons, right? So the typical column denouncing this culture of PED abuse in baseball will say, like, it's destroying the legacy of baseball, it's destroying the record books and the integrity of the game, and it's destroying the faith of young children in their heroes. And I don't quite agree with that.
Right.
My take, though, tracks with that, though, in a certain way, which is, I think it does hurt the integrity of the game in that it is an unfair competitive advantage for rich players who are willing to break the law for this advantage, right? Because using these drugs in these amounts is illegal, right? And you have to get a doctor willing to supply them to you in a criminal fashion. And so that rewards an Alex Rodriguez or Ryan Braun or Barry Bonds over a minor leaguer who is just trying to get onto the team and who's playing clean. So I think there's a fairness issue there. I think there's a long-term health issue for players, which is that if they're delivering their health over to Tony Bosch, I think, they may get jacked up for a few seasons and increase their fast twitch muscles, but their kidneys and adrenal glands and everything else could be a mess when they're long retired. And then lastly, I think it is bad for kids, and I do have a what about the children case, which is that if drugs are tacitly allowed at the major league level, and it's just a wink and a nod, I think that in turn helps to legitimate and strengthen a culture of PED abuse among high schoolers, and it encourages your high school coach to start treating your kid like his own personal laboratory experiment.
Right.
So that's all. It's not about destroying faith or a mythical integrity. It's just a simple. I think baseball's culture and ecology is better without a chemical arms race. That's it.
I pretty much agree with you. I think a lot of people, what the piece I wrote yesterday, I think a lot of people took as me being pro steroids, and I'm not pro steroids. I 100% prefer a clean game of baseball. It's like I said, I'm just skeptical. I know that I'm not going to stop watching because there are steroids in baseball. I'm skeptical that other people will too, and I think that is a major problem when it comes to ridding the game. I think that the economic incentives for both players and for the game are still somewhat skewed towards looking like they're doing something, but maybe not actually doing something. And again, I'm somewhat skeptical that the agreement that they have in place right now is actually doing something. If I was thinking about this today, basically everyone agrees or thinks that Alex Rodriguez has been doing steroids at some point over the last 9 years, right?
Yeah.
Over that time that we know of, Alex Rodriguez hasn't failed a drug test in Major League Baseball. He failed one in 2003, but that was the preliminary test that were supposed to remain confidential. If these guys are doing this, when you look at other sports and you look at Lance Armstrong and Tyson Gay and Asafa Powell and all of this, I'm not sure that the test and suspend system is the most deterrent way to do it. And I'm not a proponent, as some other people are. I've seen Dave Zirin and some other people write of the legalize and regulate argument. I'm not sure I'm there. I don't know that that's the best solution or even a good solution. But I think that there is some merit to the idea of treating this as a public health issue, and maybe trying to bring it a little bit out of the shadows and figuring out how are we actually going to deter guys from doing this, because it is I do view it as a problem. I don't want a dirty game of baseball, but I think it's questionable whether we're actually approaching steroids and performance enhancing drugs in sports in the most effective way right now in terms of how do we limit the use. I think it's a little idealistic and probably impossible to rid the games of performance enhancing drugs. And I think so many of the people in charge are just unwilling to accept that.
Yeah, I think it will be. I think it's very difficult to get rid of it. And I actually am for liberalizing the use of some PED, some banned substances, in the case of injured players who, under the supervision of a doctor, could use some of this stuff to get healthy and come back.
Definitely, right? I think that's a good idea.
So that's something that Ryan Madsen brought up earlier this year. I think that's legitimate, and I think it'd be very easy for Major League Baseball to set up an independent committee of doctors who just review the treatment options that are being given to injured players, right? Because they could see, okay, is this a real doctor? Is he really a presence in his community? And what is the what is the treatment schedule? And then, yes, we'll run a test for, elevated testosterone levels and just monitor the treatment. I actually think that could be accomplished with ease. And that's something that could be talked about more openly. However, I just do think that there is, and it seems like the reaction of the players' union reflects that there is a critical mass of players who also want, as much as possible, a clean game. And who
Right.
don't want to turn themselves over to Tony Bosch just to stay even. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, there are some. I really respect Joe Sheenan, even though I argue with him on Twitter about this, because he sees the union as folding underneath the pressure of ownership, and he thinks that ownership and C-League have in the case of steroids found their wedge issue to divide the union and to begin making gains against the players' union. And I think there's merit to that. I think he's right to a degree. I just wouldn't go as far as he does in dismissing steroids as an issue for the players. You know.
Well, and he was arguing today that there's no evidence that steroids actually work, right?
Yeah, that I thought was going way too far.
Yeah, that is way too far. I mean, if they didn't work, we wouldn't be using them in all sorts of fields of medicine and everything else. And
that's right. Yeah, because I mean, he mentioned the sort of the bracelets that some players wear.
Right. I saw that
stuff like that. But that is actually bunk, ad copy from these players. It's maybe it's a psychosomatic thing, but human biochemistry is a real science, and even though you cannot translate a pill into a home run, like you could never measure the contribution a pill makes to hitting a homer, but you could also never measure what practice or concentration adds to hitting a homer. But you know that performance-enhancing drugs, it results in physical changes, increased strength, fast twitch muscle response, muscle recovery time, that are components of athletic performance.
I think that's the biggest thing people misunderstand about steroids, right? Is that it's not so much that it makes you stronger; it's that it makes you recover faster and keeps you a little bit healthier. I think, right? I mean, it's kind of that difference where, a guy who's not taking steroids can't lift weights as often. That's where the muscle mass comes in. But it also, the pitcher who's juicing in late August might still have that extra mile an hour on his fastball that other guys are losing at that point in the season. And the batter that's juicing might still have that extra half a mile an hour on his bat speed that other guys are losing. And that's where the difference comes in.
Right, and there's other components to that too, right? So if your muscles recover faster, and you can spend more time in the gym and work out harder and recover faster, you're not as sore when you're performing as someone without it would be. And so more of your energy and acuity can be focused on, say, hitting a baseball or making your pitch. It's not, your body is, less distracted by pain or the process of recovery. So there are a lot of elements where it's a contributing factor. It's sort of like, I think a liberal could compare it to like climate science, which is we don't know, you can't trace a percentage of pollution to an individual weather event, right?
Right.
Because weather is a kind of entire ecosystem, ecological event. But you can say that this would be a contributing factor to more intense storms or more extreme weather patterns. And I think it's the same thing with steroids, is that, and performance-enhancing drugs, is that you can't say, okay, he hit 5 extra home runs because he took X, Y, and Z. But you can say he was stronger, he recovered faster, he, his fast twitch muscles were more responsive, his bat speed increased, and therefore he's more likely to hit home runs.
Exactly.
Anyway, I think it's an issue. I'll be interested to see how long the biogenesis investigation goes on, and I do wonder if, after the unbelievable humiliation Braun has taken in the media, I do wonder if that has more of a deterrent effect on potential PED abusers than, a 50-game suspension that's forgotten about.
I think that's unquestionable. I think it's definitely true that, and this is what I was talking about with the importance of fans. I think they are the people. The fans are the people who can be the real deterrent to this, is because if they care, and if they quit buying Ryan Braun jerseys or quit voting Ryan Braun into the All-Star game, if they quit going to Brewers games or quit going to, say we're in D.C. and people quit showing up to watch when the Brewers are in town. I don't know. However they want to show their disgust. I think that's the way that it actually acts as a deterrent. I'm not necessarily sure the 50-game, 100-game suspension works, because I just think we look throughout sports and these drug tests are just so easy to beat. And I think most of these guys think that they can beat these tests. I think that they look around and they think that the economic incentives of using the drugs outweighs the risks of failing a test. And I think it's hard to make that a deterrent. One of the examples is, Lance Armstrong for 7 years was winning the Tour de France and probably took more drug tests than anyone in the world, and that we know of never failed one.
Right.
And yet was doping the entire time. And that's where I question it. That's where I actually think there's an interesting aspect to the legalize argument that no one makes. And again, I'm not necessarily on board with this legalize and regulate plan, though I do like the liberalize for medical reasons plan that you put forth. I think most people view, if we legalize these drugs, everyone will use them, and the people who don't want to use them for health reasons will then be at a disadvantage. And I'm not sure that's the case. I think actually, if fans actually prefer a clean game, and we bring these drugs out of the shadows, I think there is a chance that you could at least maintain use it where it is now, or even reduce it, because the fans would know. We wouldn't have to speculate if Chris Davis was taking steroids. We wouldn't have to speculate if Barry Bonds was in 2003. We'd know, and that if they care, then the people who we knew were doing it, well, they'd probably get a lot of backlash for it. And I'm just guessing at that. I'm not sure that's definitely true. It just seems like it could be a way that you reduce usage here.
It's hard to know, right? I mean, there's definitely. I mean, listen, this is sports, right? I mean, it's entertainment, and there are sports where, I think football is a sport where I think the fan maybe doesn't care,
right?
As much, and baseball, and maybe it's just me and the type of person that's a baseball fan. We're very prissy about this stuff in a way. You could argue, at least, that we're very prissy about drugs, or at least we are now. And Joe Sheenan makes that argument, right? That, well, greenies were used, liberally during the 60s, and different steroids were used during the 30s, etc. And that's all true. Although I would say that back then, the teams made that stuff available to all players,
right?
Which is different than today, where my fairness concerns are. And in some cases, those were legal substances to buy, whereas now treating yourself with, the kind of treatment that Jeff Pearlman describes Barry Bonds using in his book,
right.
I mean, that's very illegal, very dubious for Bonds' long-term health.
Right.
So, in any case, I do think the legalize it argument has something for it. I don't dismiss it out of hand. I actually think it's more coherent than some of the other talking points out there, which seem to want to just not talk about this issue.
Right.
Where it seems like the idea is somehow we could go back to 1998 and just imagine, oh, well, these guys are spending more time in the gym than they were in the 70s. I don't think we can put that genie back in the bottle.
Right. Which brings up an interesting question, too, is, we see the media now freak out about all of this, right? And how much of that do you think is because for 15 years the media was kind of complicit?
I don't know. It's funny because I remember in '98, it really was the talking point. They would say the ball is juiced, right?
Right.
That was the joke. The ball is juiced. And a lot of media were also saying, oh, it's just this new fitness craze has finally hit baseball where people are training, as hard as Karl Malone trains in basketball, or, and gets a body like that. Now we look back at the footage of McGuire and Sosa, and it's like we laugh because we look at their forearms and their heads and say, wow, that's a really obvious steroid user. But at the same time, I remember in 2003, I started listening to a sports talk radio show in New York, Wally and the Keeg, and they seemed to be pretty alone in saying, hey, all these players are juice monkeys. No one's doing anything about it. It's a fraud. It's a sham. And it's really going to blow up someday. And then a few years later, it does. Then
right.
Canseco's book comes out. So I don't know. The media has always had a kind of funny relationship with sports, right? Because you're rooting. Many newspaper columnists, beat writers, in a sense, are rooting for the teams they cover, and they're certainly rooting for the sports they cover.
Right.
Well,
you have to, right? It's providing you a job.
Yeah, exactly. Who would root for the contraction of their team,
right.
the team they cover, or for or for making the sport they cover more unpopular? You would. And that's something that affects almost every beat in media to some degree. And it's a human thing, right? If you spend time around people, you start to sympathize with them and root for them to a degree.
Right.
You almost have to be a sociopath not to. In any case, I wanted us to just switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit more about your writing, and about progressive goals in sports. What's the genesis of your gig, and what do you hope to do with it?
Well, so I guess so I started as a sports writer back in college. So kind of how I got into writing. I was a journalism student at the University of Kentucky and covered the basketball team and the hockey team and the football team and the women's tennis team and every other thing they had on campus. And then kind of quit. I kind of got a little interested in politics and ended up in D.C. for an internship, and then ended up back in D.C. and came to TP, and where I did a lot, more economics and stuff like that, and just kind of started writing about sports a little bit when Alyssa Rosenberg got here to do a culture blog, and that was kind of a shift in the way that Think Progress looked at things and said, we can look at issues outside of the pure political world and the policy world. And, I wrote a few posts for Alyssa. They weren't really political. They were more, I think the first one I wrote for her was about, was when Joe Frazier died. And I just wrote about, how everyone only thinks about Joe Frazier in the context of Muhammad Ali, and that even though he wasn't outspoken, he was still kind of a barrier breaker in his own way. And and then we, it just kind of progressed from there, and we got the idea that maybe it would be something to do. We, on the econ page, me and my colleague at the time, Pat Garofalo, started doing more about stadium financing. And so it just kind of took off. There were so many different things and different issues, and I think with all the litigation with the NCAA and the NFL right now, there's no shortage of news that isn't just on the field sports. And I think we're a progressive news organization, right? So there's definitely an approach that is looking at sports in a progressive way, but also I think more than that, it's just kind of looking at sports in a substantive way and looking at sports and saying, there are actual issues in sports that reflect a lot of the issues in our broader society. And if we look at them in a substantive way, the way that we should, the way that we do look at them when they're in other parts of society, we might have a chance to address them. And some of those are purely progressive. I think LGBT athletes and things like that are obviously things that would skew progressive. Some of them are, labor rights and other things would also be in that camp. But there are other things that definitely cross partisan divides and political divides and everything else. I think it's interesting when you look at a lot of these stadium financing deals in cities across the country. The people who oppose them, the community groups, the politicians, whatnot, they're coalitions of like the most conservative members of those communities and the most liberal members of those communities that view it as kind of welfare. Another example of that is Tom Coburn submitted legislation earlier this year that would address the tax exemptions that big sports leagues get. And I called his office and we talked about it, and I think they were a little off-put at first about getting a call from Think Progress. And we ended up talking about it, though, and then I wrote the story, and the comments that were left on the story were like, man, I generally don't agree with Tom Coburn, but this is great. And so, there's a way to reach out and get different audiences and get people to think about sports in a different way than they normally do. And I think it's interesting.
That's right. I mean, it's funny to me because I can imagine covering sports from a progressive side actually much more easier than I can imagine it from a conservative side. And I say this as someone who came up as a conservative opinion journalist of a certain type, right? I mean, peculiar type, anti-war and all these other things. But, I kind of came to sports journalism and writing as a reprieve and a relief from politics.
Right.
And I see I totally agree with you. I mean, some of the Josh Barrow, who's kind of a centrist, but he's influenced by more free market ideas, writes very passionately about stadium financing issues, and so do you.
Right.
And I agree with that. But I mean, the issues in sports that I would describe as political do seem like issues in a liberal's wheelhouse to me. So you mentioned LGBT equality, but I could also say just issues of labor and exploitation. When you're talking about the NCAA, you may be talking about labor and exploitation issues, access and equality issues for the NCAA and other sports leagues. There's kind of I guess there are some conservative concerns in sports, and in fact, I've discovered as I've come into sports journalism that I am in the baseball world something of a chastened traditionalist, and I'm not and I even view the sabermetric skies as a revolution gone too far in some instances. So maybe I do retain that, but I don't know. I actually see your beat as quite natural in a way. And also, I mean, obviously sports, baseball integrated before a lot of other public institutions in America.
Right.
And ever since then, after Ken Burns and everything else, there's a real tendency to treat sports as an important mirror or microcosm for society.
Definitely, and I think it is. And I think you can look at so many of those, especially in that era, from I would say kind of the 40s to the 70s is when sports kind of maybe had its reached its high point of social influence in terms of being a change agent, right? Because you went from Jackie Robinson to Billie Jean King to Muhammad Ali, and in three people, you basically took on the racial barriers in America, the gender barriers in America, and then had one man who was standing up against both as both an anti-war activist and as kind of a race and religious activist too. And
right.
So I think there was so long there was so much where sports kind of pushed and pulled society in a new direction that other areas didn't do, that other things haven't quite accomplished. And I think that's what is kind of shocking about the LGBT movement, is that it kind of did it without sports, and now sports are actually kind of catching up in that area, and they're catching up in a way that where now they're actually kind of like, hey, well, we're trying to take the lead on this. When you look at how prominent we've already made some of the athletes who've come out, whether it's Jason Collins or Robbie Rogers or Brittany Griner, and kind of pushing them to the forefront. But I just think athletes have such a prominent place in our culture, for good or bad. There are good aspects to that and bad aspects to that. But they are prominent, and no one can argue that. And when they talk, it matters. And whether I'm agreeing with them or disagreeing with them, I think it's important that they do speak out and they do take sides in some of the fights. I don't want guys out there just being like raving political guys, but
right.
When they're being affected by things, or when they have friends that are being affected by things, I think it's important. And, I think it's something, like you said, I think it maybe does fit a little bit more naturally into the progressive point of view because of the labor fights and because of the LGBT movement. And, because I think progressives tend to care a little bit more about the racial and gender issues, like on their faces. And those are all very present. And so I think it is kind of a natural place to fit in and try to use as a microcosm of the larger fights that are going on.
And it's interesting too, and I agree with you that sports are trying to take a lead on things like LGBT issues. For instance, when Jason Collins came out, MLB.com has a stable of beat writers for every team.
Mm-hmm.
Every single beat writer filed a story about Jason Collins. They went, and it seems as if, I don't know what, I didn't explore or ask anyone at MLB this, but it seems that the order just came down from Major League Baseball. Hey, every beat reporter that works for us is going to do a story on this. Every locker room is going to be on record with a player or two or more saying that they support this guy, that it could happen in baseball, and that they would be well received, whatever it is. And it definitely felt like a concerted campaign. And in fact, it leads me to think that the kind of broader conspiracy theories about Ryan Braun are not true, because after his suspension came down, almost no MLB.com beat reporters filed stories about that.
Right.
Like 2 or 3 have, but those stories, that story of asking athletes about another athlete that's not on their team, mostly happened at ESPN and CBS and other places, local papers. So they're definitely trying to take a lead. And, maybe politics aren't escapable for the conservative, too, because I actually found 2 of my own concerns, which I don't know if you can characterize as conservative, came out in an issue I did of the Slurve where I talked about the attempt to move the Oakland A's to San Jose. And to me, I think this is an issue where sports is reflecting a couple of trends in our society in the 80s, 90s, and in the current decade of explosive growth and inequality. And I said that there are 2 things happening, that this rising inequality and globalization are 2 trends that I think have contributed to economic stagnation among African Americans in the United States, and that baseball, by leaving Oakland and moving closer to Silicon Valley, is also reflecting a move away of the elite institutions away from black communities. and that this is something to talk about in those terms. You know, that yes, formally baseball is becoming more diverse in that it's pulling in more players from Latin America, from Asia, and it looks like eventually from Australia. But there are fewer and fewer African Americans, and it's not just because they've been displaced that way, but they're also being displaced from baseball at the Little League level and the traveling team level, where the kids that can play on elite teams are kids who come from families with a lot of means,
right,
and start out with privilege. And so I think you know, you have two trends, a kind of national and a kind of global one, that affect one community. And baseball's move from Oakland to San Jose, if that happens, I think will be a sad reflection of that. And so, you know, I guess those were two issues, inequality and globalization, that have informed my politics, and it just came out kind of naturally.
Right.
And honestly, I got a nice response from that particular edition from readers. So I think there is a hunger for that more substantive talk about sports.
I think so too. You know, I did HuffPost Live with a couple people the other day about Keith Olbermann's return to ESPN, and the big fear there there was a conservative guest on, and her big fear was, you know, Keith's going to go on there and he's going to talk about politics and the politics of sports and things like that. And, you know, I think we tend to get caught in thinking of politics as just partisan politics, when in a lot of ways it can be policy, you know, more policy oriented, and things that if we talked about that in that way, it doesn't come across as necessarily political. And I think that's one thing, you know, with Olbermann's show, and I wrote this when it happened, is I think there is an appetite out there for a more substantive coverage of sports, more substantive coverage of the policy views, kind of a socially aware view of sports. And it doesn't have to be socially aware progressively or socially aware conservatively. It's just kind of being socially aware of how prominent a role sports play in our culture. And I think Keith Olbermann's new show is a reflection of that. I think the fact that we jumped into this space is a reflection of that. I think, you know, the fact that Nate Silver is going to ESPN now is a reflection of that. And I think if you look across the spectrum, there are more people that are talking about sports in a substantive way. You know, I get a lot of emails from conservative readers and liberal readers, and people that may just fall right in the middle on the ideological spectrum. And I think people I think we often kind of sell people short when we think that all they want to do is watch the games. And I think that you can talk about sports, and you can quote unquote politicize sports in a way that doesn't automatically turn people off. And you know, I think it's actually really important to do, because it does play such a prominent role in our society.
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act, right? I just think that you know, there's part of me that gravitated towards writing about sports because I was tired of politics, because I wanted to talk about something where the bulk of what I wrote didn't make half of the country feel threatened, or the other half feel like I was betraying them in some way, right? So I liked the slightly lower stakes,
right?
But you're right that it is a place that can be just as engaging and fulfilling to talk about in an intellectual way, and that's all to the good. So I think there's room for both sports as escapism, and as, you know, one of the things I like. I've tried to emphasize in my own work is just the pure joy of the event itself. You know, that this,
right?
You know, that there's something just very pleasing about athletic competition. You know, and
right?
I think, and now I start to get my philosophy behind that probably has political content when I say that I think our sports culture is an extremely sophisticated way of civilizing our tribalistic, energies. I think it's very good.
Right.
I take seriously the idea that baseball and football, in a sense, were responses to the Civil War, where baseball was a pastoral game that helped you forget about the war, and football is a game that helps you refight it. I think that playing baseball and football is more civilized than killing each other on a field, or
Right.
forming a street gang and fighting. It's a great thing in the United States that, for the most part, in the United States and Canada, the teams do not have a political valence tied to
Right.
it. Right. I mean, I was working on a story that I don't know if it'll ever be published. I was working on a story for a magazine. I'm not sure if it'll be published or not, about Quebec City pining and longing and working for the return of the Quebec Nordiques. And I found that, that is a rare case where the fans over 50 years old, the Nordiques meant something political to them. I mean, for them it meant sovereignty and independence from Canada. That was in the way that Glasgow Celtics means, Catholic freedom and independence for Ireland in Scotland. And Rangers means unionism and the British Empire. I think it's good that American sports doesn't have that kind of political content for the most part. So I find it civilizing and ennobling in some way. Because I do think those regional and metropolitan rivalries would always have some energy around them. And for the most part, except for, a few drunk fans and a few real tragedies like Brian Stowe in Los Angeles, for the most part, this is a very peaceful way to kind of act out those tribalistic fantasies. So
I would definitely agree, and I think I want to go back to one point you made too, because I think it's important. Again, when we started this, there were a lot of people who said, "Oh man, this is just going to be purely political." But at the same time, I think it's a lot of the substantive talk about sports is just about enjoying it. And I wrote a piece Monday about the British Open, and a couple of people on Twitter. I was just tweeting about Tiger Woods playing I think it was the first round, and a couple of people last week asked me, "And can you make the case for golf to me? Can you do a post and make the case for golf?" And I thought, sure, why not? And I wrote about why I enjoy the game of golf, both as playing it and watching it. And I think from a progressive point of view, I think that's important, because I think there are a lot of progressives who just automatically dismiss sports as something that don't matter, because they're not as substantive as other things, and they're overpaid athletes and just greedy rich guys with greedy billionaire owners, and we should just discount it altogether. But I think the most beautiful thing about sports is that there's so many different ways to enjoy it. And I think the substantive discussions about sports don't all have to be political or policy based. A lot of them can just be about the things we enjoy about them, and the things that they bring out in us, and the good and bad, and how they kind of reflect our society. There was a interesting paper that came out last week about the teams that barely qualify for the World Cup, and whether or not they become more nationalistic and aggressive, and that kind of tells you that it actually found that teams that barely qualify for the World Cup were more aggressive than teams that don't. And the point you made is one that I agree with, that for the most part, sports kind of let us channel our passions, whether they're nationalistic or regionalistic or whatever they are, for productive things. And now, obviously, that can go overboard at times. But I just think, that there's such a large part of our society that people enjoy, that are able to give people a different way to come together and speak together and sit at a game next to each other. If I'm at a game with someone, I don't care if they voted for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney or whoever. We're fans and we're there to watch the game, and it's just it can be such a unifying force and such a way for people to just talk to each other in ways they normally wouldn't. And I think I think it's really productive.
Yeah, I think we might as well. I think we can wrap it up there in a sense. That there is this kind of, without romanticizing sports to the point of just like, I think you and I both would shy away from over dignifying sports as if this were like like I said, this is an ennobling or civilizing force, and I think it is. I don't want to exaggerate that, like me watching the Mets game tonight is some great noble act on my part. It's not. It is just kind of a human joy, and that's great. But the fact that it's a human thing also means that there is political meaning and substance attached
and
to
inherent flaws.
So I'm really glad that TPM has you in a role like this, and I think it'll be really provocative to.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks, and thanks for taking the time to talk to me about it, and talk about Ryan Braun. I saw you on Chris Hayes the other night, and was hoping we'd get a chance to talk about that. So I'm glad we did that too.